All art is political twin. Please explain to me the political messaging in furry-vor art. Charlie Kirk. Adolf Hitler, Rule 34. What about Fuda? If I post a picture of me playing with my nuts, is it political?
It's been said that everything is about sex, except sex, which is about power. But what does that thing that gets your cock hard or gets your panties wet say about what you think about power? Well, a lot actually. And I should clarify before I get into the overall thesis of this video that this isn't necessarily about your politics. Your personal political views could very well be on the total opposite end of this political spectrum, but that doesn't actually matter. No matter what your personal political views or voting patterns are, that's not going to change how your fetish is coded politically. And yes, your fetish absolutely is coded a certain way. What I mean by that specifically is that the underlying base assumptions being taken for granted in the bedroom are always going to be based on our political reality and on particular political frameworks. What those political frameworks are for you does objectively say something about you, since that's the political framework your psychosexual primitive id subconscious has a foundation of. But it doesn't necessarily say your actual thoughts on any given political issue. So with that caveat out of the way, this is the Fetish Political Compass. It's a chart I made to help explain the politics of your fetish. Basically, I took all the popular fetishes people have and mapped them according to how they're coded politically. So even if your hyper-specific fetish isn't mentioned in the video, it's almost certainly similar enough to something I'm going to talk about that it can be mapped onto the compass. Again, I know you probably don't think of your kink, however mainstream or obscure, as political, but the reality of the matter, whether it's inherently sexy or not, is that everything, especially sex, is political. We live in a political world. You can't escape the political any more than a swimmer can escape the water. And that's actually a perfect segue to talk about the centrist spot on the chart, vanilla sex. Vanilla sex is the standard you can expect in the current sexual meta, much like how political centrism is what you can expect the average person to believe given the current political climate. Therefore, it's useful to elaborate not just on what vanilla sex actually entails, but what that says about our society at large. It can actually be a bit varied, with most but definitely not all instances featuring a traditional gender dynamic with the man as the dom. It usually lasts somewhere between 30 seconds and 30 minutes, includes 3 or 4 positions max, and ends when the man ejaculates, with the woman's orgasm being generally considered more of an afterthought. Tame forms of kink can be included within this framing too then, such as fuzzy pink handcuffs. Not only are they extremely accessible and cheap, but they don't actually cause any pain or reason to panic since the key is totally just for funsies. Things like minor degrading or praising, spanking, light slapping, controlled choking, and soft hair pulling are also included in this broad centrist coalition, since they don't upset the overall expected dynamic from sex too much. Though some of that stuff I just mentioned may be a tad out of the ordinary for some, especially these days, practically everyone at least knows someone who's into that sort of thing or has engaged with media that depicts it. So none of it can really be described as a large-scale social taboo, appalling, or offensive, and therefore it doesn't fall outside the over-tit window of centrism. Get it? Because it's like the over-tit window, but for sex. That's the most creative thing you're getting from me this video. The fact all of this is what's considered normal and expected from sex says a lot about our society's sexual character. It says a lot about patriarchal power and the relatively subdued but still intensely obvious ways that's allowed to be exercised, such as fuzzy pink handcuffs, or the fact most men in America, despite having a high school education, still don't know what the clitoris is. Moving on to the left of the fetish political spectrum, I think is the simplest one to explain. It's the classic, the tried and true, the OG weird fetish on the internet. I'm talking about a foot fetish. The reason this is center-left coded is because I've honestly never fucking met a single woman in my life who is actually into men's feet. Like, women being into that shit at all is extremely rare, and if they are, it's probably just because they like the idea of a man kissing their feet as like a dominatrix thing. which is again why it's left-coded, because in basically every instance IRL or on camera I've seen of this dynamic, it was female-dominated. It can be pretty rough and go full dominatrix, like I said, but it can also just be a little thing couples or groups do in the bedroom that's less an overt, like, worshipping thing, which is why it's half authoritarian, half libertarian. Because, like, on one hand, the foot sort of represents the state crushing you, you know, like literally licking the boot, but on the other, it's like liberating from the patriarchy, so I don't know. I think I've explained myself pretty well here. Going down into the solid lib left of the fetish political compass, I've put self-described polyamory. This is genuinely not me trying to be polyphobic, just being a little bit comedically honest here. If someone you meet overtly describes themselves as polyamorous, you can almost be certain they're going to be pretty liberal or progressive or woke or what have you. This isn't actually the case for all polyamorous relationships, as we'll get to. Plenty of poly relationships exist, but just don't call themselves poly. Dudes in the hood call it getting bitches. Sultans and other people who are openly cool with slavery in the Gulf states call it a harem. I've been informed by many of my college colleagues that these days the kids call it a roster. But all of the other words for polyamory are generally right-coded for reasons we, again, will get into. Being in a self-described polyamorous relationship, though, necessarily means you afford equal agency to all partners. It's not a bunch of people all organizing sexually around a common person of interest. It is, in theory, an opportunity for all involved to agree to terms for a mutually beneficial relationship for all. In this way, the dynamic is truly progressive and libertarian because it's explicitly rejecting the one-man, one-woman aspect of traditional sex dynamics, and it's very decentralized. Even if there's one person in the polycule who's generally a dom, simply because there's more people in the polycule, the relationship decisions tend to be made a little bit more collectively. I'd also put specifically queer fetishes in this category, like yaoi or yuri, just because although they don't go literally balls to the walls, their very overt depiction of queer sexuality does unfortunately make it fall slightly outside the over-tit window and therefore in the solid lib left category. The reason I've put bachelorette gangbang in the bottom left is hopefully a little obvious if you get the concept by now, but essentially what I mean is a gangbang with a lot of dudes and one or very few chicks. The reason this is far lib left coded is basically that it's obviously a scenario where the woman, if she isn't holding the power in the bedroom, she is by far having the best time here. And her pleasure is the top priority of all the men in attendance. It's also highly decentralized, so even if the men invited aren't super dominant, typically no single man in this dynamic is dominating over all the other men. So all the attention is still fixated on the woman. No one's really calling the shots here, but the girl is definitely the main character, if you catch my drift. Sort of like in anarcho-communism, which is the most extreme lib-left ideology, you have a small community where everyone's equally distributing resources like food, but here you get a small gang of chads equally distributing the poon. So, take that however you will. The last and perhaps funniest one to explain from the lib left square is the far neutral left position of piss and shit, otherwise known as scat and piss. For some reason, if you have a piss fetish, you don't get a fancy fucking name. You just gotta wear a piss fetish like a badge of honor. Anyways, again, even though there are many exceptions, of course, I do think the vast majority of this sort of content is female-dominated, or at least female-centric. Typically, content featuring these characteristics will also be like a dominatrix type shit, but not always. If you know, you know. You know what I mean? So you can definitely have more centralized or more decentralized versions of this. Yeah, no, this section's just fucking horrible. You know, the piss and shit could represent like the state literally pissing on you and telling you it's raining, right? Or it could represent just like the total collapse of the bourgeois social order and all of its etiquette. So it could really be an off left or lib left. Yeah, I don't really know what I'm saying with this one. Moving on to something that's definitely way less problematic, here in the middle libertarian section we have just straight up fucking cheating. Just the act of being disloyal itself is not something people typically get off on. That's why people being disloyal usually lie about it. Well, that to avoid being caught, obviously, but there are certainly some people who are into this explicitly. Like those YA novels, for example, where the plot is basically just a cheating fantasy and nothing else. I would also put things like most forms of voyeurism and exhibitionism in here, just because those sorts of dynamics can empower either the man or the woman as the one in control of the situation. It's typically very decentralized, with the very thing they're getting off on being the absence/rejection of explicit laws or rules. So for those reasons, I think it's best to put it in the center libertarian column. This does not, however, cover over cuckoldry type voyeurism, gangbangs, threesomes, or like wife swapping between couples type shit. Those are all different things which we will get to. But first we need to talk about Diddy. Not really Diddy specifically, but I honestly couldn't think of a better term to describe this type of fetish. You know, the freak-offs. There is absolutely a certain type of person whose dream it is to be the victim at a Diddy party. And listen, this is genuinely not trying to victim blame, but we also not trying to slut shame, you know what I'm saying? Anyways, what I mean by Diddy party, in case this is still too esoteric for you, is just like a super chaotic gangbang where there's both tons of men and tons of women. Nobody's really the clear center of attention or the dom. Everybody's just sort of going at everybody as hard as they can. That's why this would be in like the extreme center libertarian position on the chart, right? Because men and women are getting their cheeks clapped and clapping each other's cheeks, so it's not like a traditional dynamic, but it's not exactly progressive either. And it's also not a very controlled environment, not a lot of formal rules, so that's why that's there. Over here in the solid lib right square, we have what I've labeled swing. But this is going to be another sort of broad category that encompasses a range of dynamics that are coded in a similar way. So like, obviously swinging, basically wife swapping if you didn't know, that would obviously be included. Also 2+1 type threesomes where the third person is part of the sex but definitely not part of the relationship or anything like that. But not cucking, again, we will get to that. For now, though, I'm sticking with dynamics where both members of the couple are at least involved, but there's extra stuff going on, because, you know, it's a sexual free market, and they're just exploring their options, that sort of thing. But, like, they're still doing it within the confines of trying to be a normal straight couple, right? So, like, these people probably aren't very open about their little adventures. They're probably very private, you know? That's why it's libertarian coded, because, you know, it's all about free market and privacy, while also trying to at least appear inoffensive to the traditional relationship dynamic. The big difference between these guys and the self-described poly people is the level of secrecy, right? So like by having a poly relationship but not actually describing it as poly, all the actual decisions in the relationship are made privately between the two main partners. Again, regardless of whether the people they're adding into the mix are dom or sub themselves. The only actual agents are the original partners. So it's sort of like the relationship is a private corporation. They decide to go public, and then the two founders of the company buy up 90% of the stock so they still make all the real decisions. The bachelor party definitely represents the extreme libertarian right, you know, because like anarcho-capitalism says that the best men naturally rise to the uppermost echelons of society through the so-called perfect competition of the free market. Likewise, this sexual fantasy is basically like, hey, this guy is the fucking Chad. He's earned his place via climbing the ladder of the sexual free market, and now he gets to slay as much poon as he wants. This is obviously quite the example of patriarchal practices and privileges taken to the absolute extreme. But it's also a clear rejection of our society's puritanical values and ethics, which are, of course, patriarchal as well. It's allowing women the freedom to be sexually aroused, but only in the context of pleasing the top dog, alpha male, or whatever. A bit up on the fetish political spectrum, we have what I've labeled trad BDSM. Now, one thing that might throw some people off about this is even though I've called it trad BDSM, it's both authoritarian right and left. Since at this point in the video I've been hammering home about how more traditional dynamics go on the right side of the spectrum. That's still true, which is why it's in the center, because A, there are even more right-wing coded fetishes that we will get to, and B, a lot of the times this sort of dynamic is, interestingly, more popular with women than men. Like, I honestly don't know a lot of men who find the 50 Shades of Grey stuff sexy. I'm not saying I haven't met them, but the vast majority of people I've met who are into this sort of sexual dynamic were women. This is likely because after decades of patriarchal subversion of female sexuality as a whole, with many women being outright depraved of feeling sexual pleasure independent of pleasing the man, it's no surprise that for many women the best possible way for this to go is to surrender themselves to an erratic and aggressive, albeit intelligent man who's very concerned with your level of sexual pleasure, but still all under the veneer of serving the man, who also sort of represents the state and society, literally holding you hostage and suffocating you. This is probably why, even though this dynamic explicitly gives more power to the man, in most real-life couples I've talked to who do this stuff, it's the girl who asks to start. CNC stands for consensual non-consent for those who don't know, and I mean, fuck, this video's already getting pretty fucking long, isn't it? Look, it's basically the state raping you. Like, just an even more extreme version of BDSM. For those of you who don't know the difference between CNC and BDSM, it's whether they stop after you say no. If you've had to come up with an alternative safe word for no, then you've probably crossed the line, I'd say. You get off on the idea of your partner raping you and making you their little plaything, obviously not actually doing it, but like, yeah, so that sort of means your psychosexual subconscious is excited by the idea of a totalitarian state taking all your rights and just making you a little peon, a little peasant, a little worm, powerless against the panopticon surveillance state. The mommy-dommy fetish thing is definitely solid authoritarian left, because like it's very much a subversion of traditional gender roles, right? Like that's sort of the whole point. But it's also sort of analogous for how the state should be used as a weapon to crush the bourgeoisie, or men in this analogy, because it does liberate women from the patriarchy, but rather than establish like collectively owned relationships, it just gives all the power to the women instead of the men. So basically misandry versus feminism. That's how you can understand the off-left, lib-left divide here. This would also include like older sister or aunt roleplay, or giving the woman a dick in any way, so like pegging, fuda, or she-male, or whatever the fuck, because the dick is literally like an analogy for your very agency, and therefore submission to a chick with a dick is sort of like submitting your rights to an authoritarian socialist regime. JOI, which stands for jerk-off instructions for those who don't know, means a woman instructing you, the male viewer, on how to, you know. But anywho, this is definitely extreme authoritarian left-coded. You know, the woman telling you exactly how and when to stroke your cock is sort of like the state telling you exactly what food, entertainment, and housing you're allowed to have. Just surrendering overall your individual autonomy, even the most basic functions of yourself. In real life, that means control over you. For this fetish, that means control of your dick. Over here on the right of the compass, we have what I've broadly labeled magic, which I understand that might have raised some eyebrows already, since people don't really get off to like casting spells and shit. But people do definitely get off to depictions of vampires, werewolves, elves, witches, and the like. I should note now that for this category specifically, I'm only talking about like humanoid creatures of magic. Animal-human hybrids we will get to, I promise, but for now let's just talk about this real quick, since you hopefully get what I mean by the category. Regardless of which gender gets to have literal magic fucking powers, the foundations of modern Western sex and dating culture are not typically challenged. Again, this isn't to say you can't find plenty of exceptions on Wattpad or whatever, but certainly every popular example of this fetish I'm familiar with follows this general trend. This sort of stuff is right-coded mainly because basically every instance, at least I can think of in popular media depicting a magical humanoid creature and a human getting it on, it's essentially like a hypercharged version of your traditional masculine-feminine dynamic. If it's a man who's a sexy vampire, he's got to be a super dominant and aggressive vampire. And if it's a woman who's a hot elf, then she's got to be a super hot elf so she can be hypersexualized and objectified. Now it's finally time to talk about the furry vor porn I've been alluding to since the beginning. I don't have to fucking introduce furries to you, you know what furries are, but why is being a furry far center right coded? Well, because much like with vampires and werewolves, most sexualized animals tend to either be hyper-objectified submissive women or hyper-aggressive dominant men. Although there is a notable exception of the absurd amount of furry fuda content, see previous section for that explanation. The majority of furry content appeals to a certain right-wing coded fantasy of a dainty, innocent woman being ravaged by a significantly more powerful man. These deep psychosexual instincts being represented by literal animals intensifies the degree to which the urges are animalistic. A subconscious desire maybe to return to an era where being stronger generally meant you got to determine whether sex occurred, which is also probably why rape is such an absurdly common theme in furry porn as well. Again, I must stress, especially with these far-right coded fetishes, that not everybody who has these fetishes shares the political beliefs to which their fetish is coded. It's also certainly not the case that everyone who has these fetishes actually would find things like an animal-human hybrid or rape or a 15-inch dragon cock sexy in real life. These are artistic expressions of the deepest emotions imaginable. Emotions uncontrollable, and hence deeply revealing of our society or perhaps even humanity's biases towards some of these extreme patriarchal dispositions. The psychosexual image of a dominant animal creature can represent an authoritarian state, but it can also represent the absence of state control over the sexual marketplace, like I said earlier, a return to sexual anarchy. Vor can typically be viewed through the same lens, as it represents literally being swallowed by the dominant forces in society, whether those forces itself come from inside or outside the state. Either way, furry vor is absolutely political. It wouldn't exist, nor be as repulsive as it is to most if it weren't for the broader cultural context that created the creators of furry vor porn. And that context is extremely political, and typically at least reflects a base assumption that the stronger literally get to eat the weak, which is why it's over here on the far right. And now, for the other one I've sort of been leading up to the whole video, the fetish I've put in the authoritarian right corner, being a fucking cock. Oh my fucking god, this video is off the fucking rails. Daddy Dom stuff is coded similarly, believe it or not, but like actual Daddy Dom roleplay, not just a girl saying the word daddy. That's 100% vanilla by now. I'd also include stepsister stuck in the dryer type shit, but not stepmom. That's different. I covered that a couple minutes ago. You know, the dad represents the state. You guys probably have caught on by now. I don't gotta go in depth there. But being a cuck is 100% undeniably far right coded. Yet that opinion alone could cause this video to devolve into the most toxic comment section that's ever been seen on the platform. The data suggests it's a fact though, but like I've been saying the whole time, that's not even what we're talking about. Regardless of whether or not the individual personally into this stuff is right or left wing, the foundational base assumptions of literally all cuck porn are borderline fascistic, and they are as follows. 1. The stronger man, nation, necessarily has a right to exert full control over the woman's society. And 2. The cuck, smaller, weaker nations can't challenge the authority of the bull, larger, stronger nations. This is textbook fascist nationalistic rhetoric, and is why, despite the fact a majority of cuck porn features black men but is consumed by white men, not even fucking touching on the reasons for that by the way, but nevertheless, the black man is always featured as a criminal, rapist, or violator of some kind. So it certainly isn't progressive coded, even if you want to argue the majority of the dudes who are into it are left wing, which is also not true, but I digress. And now, at long last, we get to talk about by far the most appalling kink, which is predictably coded by the most appalling politics. Someone being interested in this fetish does not necessarily mean they're a pedophile, nor does it mean they're a Nazi, but the fact of the matter is that this dynamic, by its very nature, empowers the one role-playing the adult, typically the man, to a degree unreachable by any other fetish, particularly because the partner is role-playing a literal child. So in this way, it's analogous for a parasitic, vile, disgusting government violently exterminating an entire group of people by portraying the roles of a parasitic, vile, disgusting adult violating a child. That's all I'm saying about this one. I hope y'all enjoyed the video. Hey guys, thank you for watching. That was my first ever video on YouTube, so if you guys have any tips or tricks you'd like to share with me, please let me know in the comments. I really hope you enjoyed it. Other than that, please subscribe. I will be posting videos weekly from now on, hopefully. Please stay up to date with what I'll be doing. I'll be posting in the community tabs and on social media about the next uploads. And yeah, au revoir.